Hello, and thanks for stopping by. Today I'm in the Royal Borough of Greenwich, which with its magnificent views and seaside-like atmosphere has long been one of my favourite parts of London. It's also an area that's crammed with history, and right now I have an extra special reason to be excited, as the lovely folk from the Royal Museums Greenwich Collection have kindly invited me to take a peek around one of their gems, the Royal Observatory, outside the usual opening hours. That means, in this video, we're going to have this magnificent sight all to ourselves. So, without any further ado, let's go and see what the stars have in store for us. Nowadays, we take accurate navigation for granted, largely thanks to the global positioning system, which, with its fleet of satellites, is on hand to guide ships, aircraft, cars, and in many cases, even the maps on your mobile phone. Finding your way wasn't always this easy, of course. Although sailors in centuries past were able to measure their latitude, which determines how far north or south you are, the ability to work out longitude, that being how far east or west you are from a given point, was far more problematic, a matter of life or death in many cases, as the lack of such information could lead to shipwrecks. It was known that each 15-degree section of longitude represented a 1 hour time difference. So, in theory, a sailor could work out their position by comparing the time of day at their current location with the time back home. A time difference of 5 hours, for example, would indicate that your ship was at a 75-degree longitude from the departure point, 5 multiplied by 15. This was easier said than done though. To make such calculations, you needed to know what time it was back at the port from which you'd left, which should be simple enough, just have a clock on board set to that time zone, right? Well, no, not really. Back then, clocks were absolutely useless at sea, as the pendulums required to keep them ticking were unable to cope with the constant bobbing and rocking of the waves. This meant they'd either be knocked out of kilter or would just stop working altogether. With shipping venturing further and further afield by the 1600s, the problem of being unable to judge longitude was becoming an increasingly serious one. And so it was for this reason, in 1675, that King Charles II established the Royal Observatory for the purposes of, in his own words, rectifying the tables and the motions of the heavens and the places of the fixed stars, so as to find out the much desired longitude of places, for perfecting the art of navigation. Despite already having his hands full with the rebuilding of London following the Great Fire, which had occurred just 8 years previously in 1666, the task of constructing a Royal Observatory was handed to Sir Christopher Wren. In choosing this site, which as we'll later see has become key to measuring the world's time and distance, Wren opted for Greenwich, as it was perfect for a number of reasons. Firstly, it lay within a royal park, meaning the king already owned the land. Being so close to the Thames, this location also offered ease of access. Secondly, there was a hill within the park, and for an observatory of course, it made sense to place the building on higher ground. Thirdly, the hill in question had once been home to Greenwich Castle, a structure that had lain derelict since the English Civil War, and Wren suggested it to be a good idea to incorporate the castle's ruins into the new observatory, as a means of keeping construction costs down. The price did indeed come in low, a snip at £520, which is about £84,000 in today's money, and Christopher Wren stated he designed the complex for the observator's habitation and a little for pomp. Building work started in August 1675, and less than a year later, in July 1676, the observatory was ready to begin work. To put that date into some context, the Royal Observatory was up and running a full 34 years before another of Wren's masterpieces, St Paul's Cathedral, was even consecrated. The very first astronomer put in charge of the Royal Observatory was Derbyshire-born John Flamsteed, who some years before had accurately predicted two solar eclipses, which occurred in 1666 and 1668, and later he'd gone to make the earliest known recorded sightings of the planet Uranus. For his impressive new role, Flamsteed was blessed with the title Astronomical Observator, which was later rebranded the Astronomer Royal, and it was a position he went on to hold for 42 years. As John Flamsteed was the very first Astronomer Royal, it will come as no surprise to discover that this grand building, which forms the oldest part of the observatory, is named Flamsteed House in his honour. As part of the deal, Flamsteed, along with his family and servants, were provided with accommodation on the site. Over the following 250 years, this suite of rooms were expanded, and in total, 9 Astronomer Royals lived here. The stunning Octagon Room, which as the name suggests is 8-sided, forms the oldest part of the observatory. Also known in the past as the Great Room and the Star Room, it is a rare surviving example of a Christopher Wren design interior, and is presented here pretty much as it would have appeared back in 1676. The Octagon Room was the main working area for Flamsteed and his assistants, as indicated by these tall windows, which were designed to accommodate 17th century telescopes, which, as demonstrated by this replica, were very rudimentary. The high ceiling was also necessary to provide space for these important clocks, which, to aid their incredible accuracy, required extra long pendulums. The clocks, which were crafted by Thomas Tompion, who worked on a now lost Water Lane, which once ran off of Fleet Street, were vital for Flamsteed. Without them, he wouldn't have been able to accurately map the stars, and in working with them, he was able to prove the theory that the world rotated at a constant rate. As you may imagine, working here at night would have been rather chilly, and so the astronomers had to wrap up warm. This cosy looking dressing gown was once owned by the 5th Astronomer Royal, Neville Maskelyne, who worked here between 1765 and 1811. Another instrument you can see in the Octagon Room is this quadrant, which dates from 1760. The quadrant was used as a mount for telescopes, and also helped to measure the angle of the stars. Originally, it had a set of wheels fitted too, allowing it to be transferred between windows. Despite being supposedly tailor-made for stargazing, there was a major flaw with the Octagon Room, that being that none of its 8 walls aligned with the meridian, which meant Flamsteed was often forced to conduct much of his work a short distance away from a small brick shed located in the observatory's garden. The second Astronomer Royal to live and work at the Royal Observatory was a very famous fellow indeed, Edmond Halley. This is the Halley family's tombstone, which can be seen in the observatory's courtyard. The former astronomer is in fact buried in the grounds of the now ruined St Margaret's Church on Lee Terrace near Blackheath, but the Victorians decided to move this stone here in 1854. Edmond Halley was a truly fascinating man. He was born in Haggerston in 1656, which, technically, being within earshot of the famous Bow Bells, meant he was a bona fide Cockney. I wonder what the Cockney rhyming slang for telescope would be. Halley published papers on sunspots and the solar system while he was still in his late teens, and it was in 1682 that he observed the famous comet which now bears his name. Upon doing so, he employed Newton's law of motion to correctly calculate it past Earth every 76 years. Edmond Halley became the Astronomer Royal in 1720, and held the post until his death at the grand old age of 85 in 1742. When he had first taken up the post, Halley had faced quite a problem, as John Flamsteed's widow, Margaret, had cleaned out all of the equipment and furniture from the observatory, claiming it was the property of her late husband, and as such, Edmund had to apply for a grant in order to get the observatory kitted back out. One of the Royal Observatory's hidden gems is the Camera Obscura, an instrument which enables the sun to be observed without making direct eye contact with it. The principle of the Camera Obscura, which uses a pinhole to display a reversed image, is a precursor to photography, and can be traced back many centuries. One of the earliest ever written accounts can be found in an ancient Chinese text, which dates from the 4th century BC. There has been a camera obscura at Greenwich since the 17th century, and this current incarnation was installed in 1994. As you can see here, it's set up to provide an uncanny view of the Greenwich skyline. It took the early batch of royal astronomers many decades to complete the work of mapping the stars, around 100 years in fact, which enabled a method of ascertaining longitude, known as the lunar distance method, to be developed. However, the need to maintain accurate timekeeping on board a ship was still deemed vital, and as clocks still relied upon pendulums, it was also still very much elusive. Knowing how much of a game changer it would be therefore to crack this problem, the British government decided to offer up the huge cash prize of £20,000, equivalent to about 2 million in today's money, to anyone who could develop an accurate timekeeper that would work at sea. And this is where the genius, John Harrison, comes in. Born in Fulby, West Yorkshire in 1693, John Harrison was a carpenter by trade, although he also taught himself clock repair, and by the age of 20, he'd built his first clock from scratch, which rather appropriately was made entirely from wood. Upon hearing of the government's competition, John sat down to design a clock, or to be more precise, a chronometer, which he believed would be immune to the forces of the ocean, and in 1730 he took his blueprints down to London with the aim of securing funding. In doing so, he met Edmond Halley, who was greatly impressed with the design. However, feeling he wasn't qualified enough to judge the proposed mechanism, Halley sent John over to George Graham, a master clockmaker who'd worked alongside fellow timekeeper specialist Thomas Tompion. George was also taken with the design, so much so that he loaned John £200 to create the timepiece, a device which has since become known as H1. And here it is. A thing of true beauty, I'm sure you'll agree. H1, which, like all of John Harrison's chronometers, still works today, is much bigger than you probably imagine. It weighs 33 kilograms, and it has separate dials for hours, minutes, seconds, and days of the month. With it, John was determined to cheat gravity, and so developed a system of springs and bar balances, which, and this is only me putting it very simply, cradled the timekeeping components, making them immune to anything the sea could throw at them. H1 was first tested on a voyage to Lisbon, and on the way out its effectiveness proved disappointing. On the return trip, however, it fared much better by correctly calculating that the ship was 60 miles off course, a crucial piece of information which enabled the crew to avoid the lethal rocks at Cornwall's Lizard Point. Following this successful trial, John was paid £250, with a further £250 promised if he could improve the device. He then moved to London, Red Lion Square in Holborn, where he'd spent many years labouring on his chronometers. This is John's second device, H2, which after 2 years' work, he decided wasn't going to work, and so quickly moved on to H3, a device which he would spend 19 years on, and due to the frustrations he had in fine-tuning it, a chronometer which he referred to as his curious little machine. After working on these larger chronometers, John finally concluded that something more compact was the way to go, and so set about crafting H4, which you can see him holding in this portrait, painted in 1767. By the time this gorgeous object was completed, which as you can see was quite an evolution from H1, John was in his late 60s, and so it was left to his son William to trial H4 on an arduous voyage to Jamaica. It worked perfectly, being found to be just 5.1 seconds behind time upon its arrival in the Caribbean. Following John Harrison's lifetime of work, other clockmakers were able to capitalise on his discoveries, and before long, chronometers were commonplace aboard ships. In this capacity, Greenwich continued to play an important role, as each of the Royal Navy's chronometers had to be tested here before being permitted to be sent to sea, a factor which further enhanced the area's connections with timekeeping as well as navigation. It wasn't until 1760 that the 5th Astronomer Royal, Neville Maskelyne, drew up the observatory's first set of regulations, followed a few years later in 1766 with the publication of the first nautical almanac, which provided simplified tables and calculations for working out longitude. Unsurprisingly, given the wealth of information this book contained, the nautical almanac proved popular in many countries, meaning more seafarers than ever were reliant upon observations made from Greenwich for their calculations. Greenwich itself representing 0 degrees longitude, the Prime Meridian, a vital navigational component which you can see represented here by this famous metal strip, which essentially divides the eastern and western hemispheres. It was for this reason, following an international conference held in Washington DC in 1884, that Greenwich was officially adopted as a place from which distances, as well as the Earth's 24 time zones, were measured. Greenwich already having been in use for so long that to change anything would have led to all manner of unnecessary confusion. At a more domestic level, Greenwich's timekeeping facilities had been of great importance in Britain since the early 19th century. In 1833, the first public signal to display Greenwich Mean Time was created with the installation of the distinctive time ball on top of Flamsteed House. When this device was first put in place, the nearby Thames would have been packed with ships, the captains of which would look towards the time ball in order to set their clocks and chronometers. The signal works like this. At 12:55 PM each day, and it still is in use every day provided the weather isn't too windy, the ball is risen to half-mast. Then, a few minutes later at 12:58, it is pulled all the way to the top. Finally, at 1 PM on the dot, it drops down, thus informing those who see it of the exact time. The ball was originally made of wood and leather, and was replaced with the current red aluminium version just after World War I. If you look carefully, you may notice it looks a little battered, and that's because when the roof was being renovated in 1960, a group of workmen took the red ball down, and having been wrongly led to think it was to be chucked away, they decided to have a quick game of football with it. The second public timepiece to be installed here was the Shepherd Gate clock, which can be seen just outside the observatory's main entrance, and is named in honour of Charles Shepherd, the Leadenhall Street-based clockmaker, who made it in 1852, a year after we'd shown a similar device which used electrical impulses at the famous Great Exhibition in Hyde Park. It's a 24-hour clock, which means at midday the hands point down rather than up. As well as being the first clock to publicly display Greenwich Mean Time, the Shepherd Gate clock held national importance, as the main device it was connected to, the so-called motor clock, located inside the building and shown here, would periodically send the time via telegraph wires to cities including Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dublin and Belfast, thus enabling time across Britain to be synchronised. Prior to this system, many towns and villages based their local time on sundials, meaning there was a 30-minute time difference between the east and west of the country. As the railways rapidly grew, this system played havoc with timetables, and it was for this reason that it was decided to streamline the nation into one time zone, although it wasn't until 1880 that Greenwich Mean Time was made the legal standard. On the 5th of February 1924, a clever new method of helping the public set their clocks and watches was introduced when the BBC broadcast the first time signal on the radio, the famous 6 pips, which beep in the seconds leading up to the hour. This is the original clock, which sent the time signal via a telephone line from the observatory. Today, the pips rely upon an atomic clock located within the basement of Broadcasting House. Last, but certainly not least on our tour, is the Great Equatorial Telescope, a magnificent piece of engineering which, crafted by the Grubb Telescope Company in Dublin, was installed in 1893, as a means of keeping the Royal Observatory at the forefront of modern astronomy. The telescope is so delicately balanced you can move it using only one finger, and with its impressive 28-inch lens, it was used in the past to observe comets, planets and double stars. The distinctive onion dome beneath which the telescope is housed is fashioned from steel and papier-mâché, and in World War II the equipment was moved to safety, which is just as well because in 1944 the Royal Observatory was heavily damaged by a V1 flying bomb. By the 1950s though, smoke and light pollution were making work at the Greenwich Observatory impractical, and so the equipment was moved to a new site at Hurstmont Zoo in East Sussex, then to Cambridge University, where operations had ceased in 1998. The Great Equatorial Telescope was brought back to Greenwich in 1971, and has been available for the public to view as a museum piece since 1975. Today, although the Royal Observatory's prime role is as a museum, practical observation work has made a welcome return in recent years with the installation of the AMAT, the Annie Maunder Telescope, named after the renowned astronomer Annie Maunder, who was active in the late 19th and early 20th century, and who worked in the observatory's solar department. The telescope, which bears Annie's name, specialises in capturing high magnification images of the Sun, Moon and planets of the solar system, and on certain occasions, the Royal Observatory used it in conjunction with live streams, which you can watch online. I'll leave a link to their YouTube channel in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and special thanks again too to the Royal Observatory for kindly giving me the opportunity to explore their treasures whilst the museum was closed. It was an incredible experience, and it goes without saying that I'd highly recommend a visit, during the usual opening hours of course. I'd love to hear your own thoughts on the Royal Observatory. Have you ever seen the time ball in action? And which of John Harrison's 4 chronometers is your own personal favourite? Please be sure to let me know in the comments. Thank you so much to all of you who support my channel with your kind words, likes and shares. I couldn't do this without you. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus of course it would be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.